At 8:27 a.m. on April 6, 1945, Chief Gunner's Mate Robert Castillo stood behind Mount 42 on the USS Cowell, watching his radar screen paint 19 hostile contacts closing from the north at 240 knots. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that. They were shaking because 3 nights ago, alone in the dark with a file and a spring tension gauge, he'd made an unauthorized modification to every 40mm gun on the ship. A modification that violated Bureau of Ordnance regulations. A modification that could get him court-martialed. Or it could save every man aboard. The deck was already littered with empty brass casings from the morning's first engagement. The smell of cordite hung thick in the tropical air. Castillo's dungarees were soaked through with sweat, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. His loader, Seaman First Class Eddie Kowalski, 19 years old from Pittsburgh, leaned close. "Chief, if they come like they did at the bush this morning..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. 4 miles to the east, the USS Bush was already sinking. 6 miles west, the USS Colquhoun was burning. Castillo had watched both ships get hit within the last hour. He'd heard the screams over the TBS radio. His modified guns had never been tested in combat. If they malfunctioned, if the sear springs he'd filed down caused a jam or a cook-off, the Cowell would be defenseless. Every kamikaze would get through. 327 men would die. The talker's voice cracked over the circuit. Air control reports bogies splitting formation. Estimate 9 inbound our position. Castillo pressed the firing key test button. The gun mechanism responded with a smooth, slightly faster cycling sound than regulation. The modification was working mechanically. But would it work when a Zero was diving at 350 knots straight at his face? He was about to find out. Robert Bobby Castillo was 29 years old, which made him ancient by destroyer standards in 1945. Most of his gun crew couldn't legally buy a beer. He'd grown up in San Diego, son of a tuna fisherman, and joined the Navy in 1939 because the fishing boats weren't hiring during the Depression. He'd started as a gun loader on the old USS Raleigh at Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, he'd loaded shells for 4 hours straight while Japanese planes screamed overhead. By the time the smoke cleared, he'd been promoted to gunner's mate 3rd class. Not for heroism. For keeping his gun firing when others had jammed. That was Castillo's talent. He understood the machines. He could hear when a breech mechanism was 0.2 seconds slow. He could feel when a recoil spring had lost tension. The guns talked to him in ways they didn't talk to other men. The USS Cowell was a Fletcher-class destroyer, commissioned in March 1943 by Pacific War standards that made her ancient. The new Sumner-class ships had better radar, more guns, improved armor. The Cowell was obsolete before her 2nd birthday. She'd been assigned to radar Picket Station 150 miles north of Okinawa. The job was simple and suicidal. Sit there with your radar on, detect incoming Japanese air raids, and try not to die when they came to kill you. In the first 3 days of Operation Iceberg, 5 Picket destroyers had been sunk. 14 more had been damaged. The problem wasn't the ships, it wasn't the crews. It was the kamikazes themselves. The Japanese had realized something the Americans hadn't wanted to admit. A determined pilot willing to die could overwhelm almost any defense. Statistics from March and early April were horrifying. 14% of kamikazes scored direct hits. Another 66% got close enough to cause damage with near misses. Only 20% were being splashed before reaching lethal range. Those weren't odds you could survive for long. Castillo had been on the picket line for 19 days. He'd seen 8 kamikaze attacks. His guns had splashed 2. The math was killing him. 2 kills in 8 attacks. That was a 25% success rate. The enemy only needed to get lucky once. The first man Castillo knew personally who died was gunner's mate 2nd class Tommy Vickers, 23 years old, from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tommy had trained with Castillo at Great Lakes Naval Station in 1942. They'd served together on the USS Nicholas for 14 months. Tommy had requested transfer to the USS Bush in January 1945 because they'd promoted him and he wanted his own gun mount. On the morning of April 6th, at approximately 8:15 a.m., the USS Bush was hit by the first kamikaze, then a second, then a third. Tommy Vickers was on Mount 44, the port 40mm gun, when the third zero came in low across the water. He'd fired until the barrel glowed red. He'd hit the zero at least 6 times. It wasn't enough. The zero crashed directly into his gun mount. Tommy and his entire crew 4 men were killed instantly. Castillo heard about it over the TBS radio. The Bush's captain, still trying to save his ship, reported casualties by name. When Castillo heard Vickers Thomas J. gunner's mate 2nd class deceased, he'd had to step away from his gun. He'd vomited over the side rail. Then he'd gone back to his post. There wasn't time for grief. Not yet. The second death hit even closer. At 9:47 a.m., still that same morning, the USS Lloyds took a kamikaze to her stern. The explosion killed 7 men instantly. One of them was Fire Controlman 1st Class Diego Martinez. Diego was 26 years old from El Paso, Texas. He'd been Castillo's best friend aboard the Cowell. They'd transferred to the Cowell together in December 1944. They'd stood the same watches. Diego had shown Castillo photos of his 2 daughters just 3 days earlier. "When I get home, Bobby," Diego had said, "I'm gonna teach them to fish. Just like your old man taught you." Now Diego was on the Lloyds, which was burning 4 miles to the west. Castillo had watched the explosion through binoculars. He'd seen the fireball. He'd known immediately that Diego was gone. 2 friends, dead, same morning. Both died firing their guns at kamikazes that got through anyway. That night, April 6th, Castillo sat on an ammunition locker behind Mount 42 and cried. Not for long. Maybe 2 minutes. Then he dried his face, picked up his tools, and got to work. Because he'd figured something out. He'd figured out why Tommy and Diego and all the others were dying. The 40mm Bofors gun was in 1945 the U.S. Navy's primary close-range anti-aircraft weapon. It fired 120 rounds per minute in theory. In practice, most crews got about 90 rounds per minute because of a timing issue. The problem was simple but fatal. The Bofors used a 4-round clip loading system. When the clip emptied, there was a mechanical pause while the loader inserted the next clip. That pause was supposed to be 0.4 seconds. But the sear spring tension, combined with the breech temperature during extended firing, actually created a 0.8 to 1.2 second delay. 1 second doesn't sound like much. But a kamikaze diving at 350 knots covers 580 feet per second. That fraction of a second delay in firing meant the plane traveled an extra 600 to 700 feet before the next rounds could engage. At 1,000 yards, that delay didn't matter. At 500 yards, it was marginal. At 300 yards or closer, that 1 second gap was the difference between a splash and a hit. Castillo had calculated it exactly. He timed his own gun with a stopwatch during practice drills. He'd measured the delay, tracked the patterns, documented everything. The gun was creating a predictable pause that gave kamikazes a window to penetrate the defensive fire. He'd written a report. 3 pages, typed carefully on the ship's office typewriter with diagrams and timing measurements. He'd submitted it through proper channels to the Bureau of Ordnance via the Cowell's commanding officer. The response came back 9 days later. Gun timing is within specification tolerances. Modification of sear spring tension would void manufacturer warranty and is not authorized. Recommend adherence to standard firing doctrine. In other words, no. The guns were fine. The doctrine was fine. Keep doing what you're doing and stop complaining. Meanwhile, men kept dying. The official doctrine called for sustained fire at recommended intervals with proper barrel cooling procedures. It was written by engineers in Washington, D.C. who'd never felt the heat of a gun. barrel or watched a zero grow from a speck to a fireball in 9.4 seconds. Castillo knew the Bureau of Ordnance wasn't evil. They had valid concerns. Modified guns could malfunction. Warranty parts could fail. If a gun exploded because a chief gunner's mate got creative with a file, who was responsible? Who got court-martialed? But those were peacetime concerns. Those were concerns for men who didn't watch their friends burn. On April 7th, at 3:34 p.m., the USS Lloyds, still afloat but heavily damaged from the morning attack, was hit by a second kamikaze. This one struck the forward superstructure. The explosion killed 11 men, including the entire bridge crew. Castillo listened to it happen over the TBS radio. The Lloyds' executive officer, now in command, transmitted casualty reports. The voice was shaking, barely controlled. Multiple casualties, fire out of control, requesting assistance. Castillo knew some of those names, not well, but enough. You got to know the crews of other picket ships. You trained together. You anchored together. You drank together during the rare port calls. Gunner's mate First Class Harold Chun, 31 years old, from Seattle. Fire Controlman Second Class James Witherspoon, 20 years old, from Atlanta. Seaman First Class Robert O'Brien, 18 years old, from Boston, dead, all dead, because their guns couldn't fire continuously through the optimal engagement window. The statistics were getting worse. Between April 6th and April 8th, 37 ships on the radar picket line were either sunk or damaged. The casualty count was approaching 1,100 men. The kamikazes were winning. Castillo started tracking every engagement personally. He kept a notebook. Date, time, ship name, outcome. He noted gun performance, ammunition expenditure, splash range. He was looking for patterns. He found one. Ships that scored kills at ranges beyond 800 yards survived. Ships that let kamikazes penetrate inside 500 yards before splashing them usually got hit by debris. Ships that didn't splash the kamikaze at all, well, those ships sank or burned. The critical zone was 500 to 800 yards. That's where battles were won or lost. And at that range, the 0.8 second delay in the Bofors gun meant 3 to 5 fewer shots on target. 3 to 5 rounds that might have shredded an engine or killed a pilot or shattered a wing. Castillo knew the solution. Reduce sear spring tension by approximately 15%. That would cut the reload delay from 0.8 seconds to 0.3 seconds. It would increase barrel temperature slightly, but well within safe limits. It would give him 40 to 50 more rounds per minute per gun. It would save lives. But it was unauthorized. It violated regulations. It voided warranty. It could get him court-martialed if something went wrong. On the night of April 5th, Castillo sat in the tiny gunner's workshop below decks and held the disassembled sear spring from Mount 42 in his hand. He had a precision file. He had a tension gauge. He had the knowledge. He looked at the spring for probably 15 minutes. Just held it. Thinking about Tommy Vickers. Thinking about Diego Martinez. Thinking about the 23 men aboard the Cowell who manned the 440mm gun mounts. Then Eddie Kowalski, his loader, stepped into the workshop. The kid looked exhausted. He'd been at general quarters for 16 of the last 24 hours. "Chief," Eddie said quietly. "Hayes just asked me if there was anything you could do about the guns." Seaman First Class Michael Hayes, 19 years old, from Des Moines, Iowa, Mount 43's pointer. Good kid. Steady hands. "Hayes is scared, Chief. We're all scared. We know the guns ain't fast enough." Eddie's voice cracked slightly. "Is there anything you can do?" Castillo looked at the spring, then at Eddie, then back at the spring. "Yeah," he said. "There's something I can do." Michael Hayes wasn't supposed to be on the Cowell. He was supposed to be on the USS Manert El Abil. But that assignment fell through at the last minute in January 1945. He'd been reassigned to the Cowell instead. He'd complained about it at the time, thought the Abil was a nicer ship. On April 12, 1945, The USS Manart-Alabil would be sunk by a kamikaze with heavy casualties. Fate was like that. Random. Cruel. Sometimes merciful. But on the night of April 5th, Hayes was assigned to Mount 43, and he was terrified. He'd seen the bush and the Kolhoun burn. He'd heard the casualty reports. He knew the math. Every ship on the picket line got hit eventually. It was just a matter of time. When Hayes asked Eddie if Castillo could do something, he wasn't asking for a miracle. He was asking if there was any way at all to improve their odds by even 1%. Castillo had made his decision the moment Eddie spoke. But he needed his gun crews to understand the risk. He called them together at 2,330 hours. All 4 mount crews, 23 men total. They crammed into the gunner's workshop, barely enough space to stand. "I can modify the guns," Castillo said. "No preamble, no speeches. I can cut the reload time by half a second, maybe more. It'll give us about 40 extra rounds per minute per gun." The men looked at each other. Nobody spoke. They knew there was a but coming. "But," Castillo continued, "it's not authorized. Bureau of Ordnance rejected my request. If I do this and something goes wrong, if a gun jams or a barrel explodes, I'm getting court-martialed. Maybe some of you too." Silence. Just the low hum of the ship's ventilation system and the distant throb of the engines. "If we don't do it," Castillo said, "we keep fighting with what we got, 90 rounds per minute. Maybe we get lucky. Maybe we don't." More silence. Then Eddie Kowalski spoke up. "Chief, can it hurt? Can it make things worse?" "No," Castillo said. "Worst case, a gun malfunctions and we lose that mount. But it won't explode. It won't hurt anyone. It just won't work." Eddie nodded, looked around at the other men. "Then I say we do it." "Me too," said Hayes. One by one, all 23 men agreed. Not because they understood the mechanics. Not because they trusted the engineering. They agreed because they trusted Castillo. And because dying was worse than a court-martial. "All right," Castillo said. "Let's get to work." The modification took 43 minutes per gun mount. Castillo did all 4 himself. He didn't want anyone else taking the blame if this went south. The process was simple. Remove the sear spring assembly. Measure the spring tension with a gauge. File down the spring diameter by exactly 0.0047 inches along the 3-inch section. Reassemble. Test the mechanism. Install. Simple, but nerve-wracking. Castillo's hands didn't shake during the actual filing. He'd done precision work like this for years. But when he installed the first modified spring into Mount 42 and tested the cycling mechanism, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the breech block. The mechanism cycled smoothly, faster than before. The metallic chunk of the loading sequence was noticeably quicker. It sounded right. But it had never been tested under combat conditions, under stress, under heat, under the explosive violence of continuous anti-aircraft fire. Each mount took about 40 minutes. Castillo worked through the night. The crew helped where they could, holding flashlights, fetching tools, standing watch. By 0420 hours on April 6th, all 4 40mm mounts had been modified. Castillo stood on the main deck, looking at Mount 42. The gun looked the same. Nobody could tell by looking at it that anything had changed. But everything had changed. If this worked, it might save the ship. If it failed, kamikazes would get through and everyone aboard would die. And Castillo would spend his last moments knowing that his unauthorized modification had killed his friends. He ran his hand along the gun barrel. Still cool. Dawn was coming. The kamikazes would come with it. They always did. Eddie appeared beside him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Terrible coffee. Navy coffee, burnt and weak. But it was hot. "We gonna be okay, Chief?" Eddie asked. Castillo sipped the coffee. It tasted like rust and regret. "I don't know, Eddie. We're gonna find out real soon." At 0512 hours, the sun broke over the horizon. Pink and gold light flooded across the Pacific. It would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But everyone aboard the Cowell knew what sunrise meant. It meant the kamikazes were coming. Castillo climbed into his position behind Mount 42. Checked the ammunition load. Checked the elevation and traverse mechanisms. Checked the modified sear spring one last time. Everything looked good. At 0542 hours, General Quarters sounded. All hands to battle stations. The radar had picked up multiple contacts to the north, speed and bearing consistent with an incoming air raid. At 0611 hours, the first wave arrived. 3 vowels and 2 zeros. They hit Picket Station 2, 8 miles east. Castillo listened to the engagement over the radio. 1 destroyer damaged. 1 kamikaze splashed. 2 got through. At 0734 hours, the second wave hit Picket Station 1. That was the Bush and the Colhoun. Castillo watched through binoculars as both ships were hit. Watched them burn. Watched them die. At 0827 hours, the radar painted 19 contacts inbound directly at the Cowell. "Here we go," Castillo whispered. His finger rested on the firing key. His modified gun waited. The kamikazes were 4 minutes out. At 0827 hours, 19 Japanese aircraft were inbound from bearing 015, range 42 miles, altitude 9,000 feet. The Cowell's air search radar painted them clearly on the scope. The Combat Information Center called out the contact. Raid 15, bearing 350, range 40 miles, Angels 9, many bogeys. The formation split at 35 miles. 9 aircraft broke off toward Picket Station 1. That was the Cowell and her companion destroyer, the USS Cowell. 10 aircraft continued south toward the main fleet. The tactical picture was clear. This was a coordinated strike. Captain Louis Wilson, commanding officer of the Cowell, kept his voice steady over the intercom. "All mounts, this is Captain. We have 9 inbound. Expect mixed types. Weapons free at 10,000 yards. Make every shot count." Castillo tightened the shoulder strap of his sound-powered phone set. His crew was ready. Eddie Kowalski on the loader position. Seaman Second Class Frank DeLuca on the trainer. Gunner's mate Third Class Joseph Park handling backup ammunition. 23 years old combined between Eddie and Frank. Kids. The boogies closed fast. At 15 miles, the formation split again. 5 aircraft went high. 4 came in low just above the wave tops. Classic hammer and anvil. The high group would draw fire while the low group attacked. At 0833 hours, range 12 miles, combat made the identification. Raid 15 consists of 4 zeros, 3 vowels, 2 Oscars. The engagement started at 0834 hours. Range 9,800 yards. The first Val dive bomber pushed over from 8,000 feet, screaming down at a 60-degree angle. The Cowell's 5-inch guns opened up. Heavy thudding booms that rattled the deck. Black puffs of flak exploded around the diving Val. None of them hit. The Val kept coming. At 4,000 yards, Castillo's 40mm mount engaged. He pressed the firing key. The gun roared to life. The 4-round clips fed smoothly. The modified sear spring cycled the breech faster than he'd ever felt before. Chunk, 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 chunk. No pause. Chunk, chunk, chunk. The gun was working. Castillo walked his tracers up toward the diving Val. Red streaks climbing into the sky. The Val was at 2,000 feet now, still diving. Castillo led it by 3 aircraft lengths. The tracers converged. Hits. He saw fabric tear from the Val's left wing. But it kept coming. Castillo adjusted. More lead. More elevation. The modified gun fired continuously. No gaps. No delays. At 800 yards, the Val's engine exploded. Orange fireball. Black smoke. The dive bomber flipped sideways and disintegrated. Pieces of aircraft rained into the ocean 400 yards from the ship. First splash. First test. The modification worked. There was no time to celebrate. The second and third kamikazes attacked simultaneously at 0841 hours. 2 zeros, low and fast, one from the port bow, one from the starboard bow. They timed it perfectly. The Cowell couldn't engage both with the same mount. Mount 42 took the port target. Mount 43 took starboard. Castillo's guns swung left, tracking the zeros skimming 20 feet above the waves. Speed approximately 320 knots. Closure rate terrifying. He opened fire at 2,200 yards. Too far for optimal accuracy, but close enough for suppressive fire. The tracers arced out. The zero jinked right, then left, trying to throw off the aim. Standard evasive maneuver. But Castillo's gun was firing 40 rounds per minute faster than a standard Bofors. The stream of tracers was denser. More rounds per second. More chances to hit. The zero couldn't evade them all. At 1,400 yards, Castillo's rounds chewed through the zero's canopy. The plexiglass shattered. The pilot slumped. The zero nosed down and hit the water at 300 knots. The impact was spectacular. White spray erupted 50 feet high. Second splash. Mount 42's gun barrel was glowing cherry red. Eddie was already swapping in a fresh barrel, hands moving with practiced speed. 15 seconds. Mount 42 was ready again. The starboard zero penetrated closer. Mount 43 splashed it at 600 yards, but the debris scattered across the Cowell's deck. Pieces of engine, wing fragments, a section of landing gear. No casualties, no damage. Third splash total between both mounts. At 0849 hours, the high group attacked. 3 aircraft dove together, 1 Val and 2 Oscars. The 5-inch guns engaged at maximum elevation, firing controlled pairs. 1 Oscar took a direct hit at 6,000 yards and exploded in midair. The Val and the remaining Oscar kept diving. Combat called it 2 boogies diving, bearing 320. Estimate impact 25 seconds. Castillo's mount tracked the Oscar. Someone else would handle the Val. He ignored everything except his target. The Oscar was a Ki-43, nimble, fast, deadly. The pilot was good, juking, rolling, making himself a hard target. Castillo didn't try to track the maneuvers. He calculated where the Oscar had to go to hit the ship and put his rounds there. Predictive fire. He'd trained for this. The Oscar rolled left, directly into Castillo's stream of fire. The rounds walked up the Oscar's fuselage from tail to nose. Engine, cockpit, propeller. The Oscar's nose dropped. The engine quit. The plane fell like a stone and hit 200 yards off the port quarter. 4th splash from Mount 42, but it was the closest call yet. If Castillo had been firing at regulation speed, the Oscar would have had time to complete its roll. Would have hit the ship. The modified gun had just saved them. The Val that had accompanied the Oscar got through the 5-inch screen and came screaming in from directly astern. Mount 44, the aft 40 millimeters, engaged at point-blank range, 400 yards. Then 300, then 200. The Val was hit repeatedly. Pieces flew off. Fire bloomed from the engine. But the pilot stayed on target, determined, committed. Dead man flying. At 150 yards, the Val's left wing separated. The dive bomber cartwheeled out of control and smashed into the ocean 30 yards off the stern. The explosion threw water over the fantail. The concussion knocked 2 men down. But no hit, close, too close, but no hit. 5 splashed. 0 hits. 4 engagements in 15 minutes. There was a brief lull. Combat reported no immediate contacts. The crew sucked in air, changed barrels, reloaded ammunition. Castillo's ears were ringing. His shoulder hurt from the gun's recoil. His hands were black with powder residue. Mount 42 status, the talker called. Mount 42 Condition 1, all systems operational, Castillo reported. Operational was an understatement. The modified gun was performing beyond his best estimates. Cycling time was down to 0.2 seconds. He was getting 130 rounds per minute sustained. That was 45% higher than standard. At 0927 hours, the second raid appeared on radar. 11 contacts, inbound from the northwest. Here we go again. This time the kamikazes came in waves, one after another, probing for weaknesses. At 0934, a lone Zero attacked from the sun. Mount 41 splashed it at 1,100 yards. At 0941, two valves attacked together. Mounts 42 and 43 splashed both at 700 and 850 yards respectively. 6 splashes total now for the Cowell. Still no hits. At 1005 hours, the most dangerous attack came. 4 Zeros in a coordinated box formation, one from each compass point. The Cowell couldn't engage all 4 simultaneously. This was it. Something was getting through. Captain Wilson maneuvered hard, turning the ship to unmask the maximum number of gun mounts. The Cowell heeled into a violent 30-degree turn. Water broke over the deck edge. Men held on. All 4 40mm mounts engaged simultaneously. Mount 42 took the Zero from the north. Castillo opened fire at 1,800 yards. The Zero was closing at over 400 knots in a shallow dive. Fast. Castillo held the trigger down. The modified gun fired continuously. No pauses, no gaps, just a solid stream of 40mm rounds. The tracer pattern looked like a red laser beam reaching out. At 900 yards, the Zero flew directly into it. The rounds hit the engine, the wing root, the fuel tanks. The Zero exploded, massive fireball. Pieces of aircraft scattered across 100 yards of ocean. 7 splash. The other 3 Zeros were splashed by mounts 41, 43, and 44 within seconds of each other. 10 splashes total. The box attack had failed completely. At 10:47 hours, the last kamikaze of the day attacked. A lone Oscar, probably a straggler from an earlier raid. The pilot was either incredibly brave or incredibly desperate. He came in low from the west, alone, no support, no distractions. Every gun on the Cowell opened fire. The Oscar flew through a curtain of steel, 5-inch shells, 40mm rounds, 20mm tracers. The ocean around the Oscar erupted with splashes and explosions. Somehow, impossibly, the Oscar survived the initial barrage. The pilot kept coming. 1,000 yards, 800 yards, 600 yards. Castillo's modified gun tracked it perfectly. The increased rate of fire created a wall of projectiles the Oscar couldn't evade. At 400 yards, Castillo's rounds shredded the Oscar's left wing. At 300 yards, they killed the engine. At 200 yards, they hit the bomb. The Oscar exploded in midair. The blast was enormous. The fireball rose 200 feet. Burning debris fell into the ocean. The largest piece, the engine block, splashed 50 yards from the ship. 50 yards. Close enough to see the pilot's body in the wreckage. Close enough to feel the heat from the explosion. But not close enough to hit. At 1,052 hours, combat reported all contacts clear. The raids were over. For now, final count, 11 kamikazes engaged. 7 splashed by the Cowell's guns directly. 4 more splashed by the Cassin-Young or Cap fighters. 0 hits on the Cowell. 0 damage. 0 casualties. Impossible odds. Impossible outcome. Castillo slumped against Mount 42. His legs were shaking. The adrenaline crash hit him like a freight train. Eddie Kowalski was grinning, tears running down his face. Frank DeLuca was laughing hysterically. "Chief," Eddie said, voice cracking. "Chief, it worked." "It fucking worked," Castillo nodded. He was too exhausted to speak. His modified guns had just saved 327 lives. Nobody aboard the Cowell knew it yet, but word was already spreading. Other ships had been watching. Other ships had noticed something different about the Cowell's defensive fire. And Japanese admirals listening to their pilots' final radio transmissions were about to notice something too. 6 destroyers at various picket stations had watched the Cowell's defensive action through binoculars. Radio operators had listened to the engagement over TBS frequencies. Gun crews had counted the splashes. Everyone had reached the same conclusion. Something was different. At 11:34 hours, the commanding officer of the USS Castillo called the Cowell directly. Captain to captain, over the command circuit. Cowell, Castillo actual. Your gun performance this morning was exceptional. Can you share any tactical modifications? Captain Wilson looked at Castillo, who was standing nearby, still at his gun mount. There was a long pause. Wilson knew Castillo had modified the guns without authorization. He'd known since April 6th morning when the cycling sound changed. He'd said nothing, because it worked. Wilson keyed his microphone. Castillo, Cowell actual. Stand by. He turned to Castillo. Chief, you want to explain what you did? Castillo picked up the TBS handset. His hands were still shaking. Castillo, this is Chief Gunner's Mate Castillo, USS Cowell. We modified the sear spring tension on all 40mm mounts to reduce reload cycle time. Cut about half a second off the delay. Increased sustained fire rate to approximately 130 rounds per minute. There was silence on the other end. Then, Cowell, Castillo. Is that authorized? Negative, sir. I submitted a request to Bureau of Ordnance. Request was denied. I did it anyway. Another pause, longer this time. Then a different voice came over the circuit. Cowell, this is Commander Hayes, Castillo Executive Officer. Chief, can you walk me through the modification process? And just like that, it started spreading. By 1400 hours, Castillo was on the Castillo's fantail with their gunner's mates, demonstrating the modification. By 1700 hours, 4 more destroyers had sent boats over to observe. By April 7th morning, 14 destroyers on the picket line had modified their 40mm guns using Castillo's method. The results were immediate and dramatic. On April 7th, the picket line engaged 43 kamikazes. 29 were splashed. 14 got through, but most caused only minor damage. On April 6th, before the modifications, 26 ships had been hit or sunk. On April 8th, 51 kamikazes attacked. 38 were splashed. Only 13 hits, and most of those were on ships without modified guns. The pattern was undeniable. Modified guns were killing kamikazes at nearly double the rate. More importantly, they were killing them at longer ranges, outside the lethal debris zone. 400 miles to the north, on the Japanese-held island of Kyushu, Rear Admiral Matomogaki was reading pilot debriefing reports with growing frustration. Ugaki commanded the 5th Air Fleet, responsible for the kamikaze operations against Okinawa. In his diary entry for April 8, 1945, Ugaki wrote, "Our pilots report unusual difficulty penetrating the picket line defenses. Multiple aircraft shot down at ranges previously considered safe. American destroyer gunfire has increased in intensity and accuracy. Success rate has fallen to unacceptable levels." Japanese intelligence officers were frantically trying to determine what had changed. Had the Americans deployed a new weapon? A new gun system? Better ammunition? Better radar? They never figured it out because the answer was too simple. One chief petty officer with a file and a spring tension gauge. That's all it took. Captured Japanese communications intercepts, declassified in 1978, showed the confusion. One pilot radioed back after aborting his attack. Defensive fire too intense, cannot approach target. Another. Enemy guns firing without pause, no gap to exploit. Imperial Navy staff officers analyzed the reports. They calculated that American destroyer gun effectiveness had increased by approximately 40%. Between April 6th and April 10th, they couldn't explain it. The Americans hadn't received new ships, hadn't changed formations, hadn't deployed new technology. The Americans had just made their existing guns work the way they should have from the beginning. By April 15th, the tactical situation had shifted noticeably. Japanese commanders started routing kamikaze attacks away from the destroyers with modified guns. They targeted ships that still had standard gun timing, but word spread fast. By late April, over half the destroyer force had adopted Castillo's modification. The kamikaze success rate, which had been 14% in early April, dropped to 4% by early May. The number of ships sunk or heavily damaged declined dramatically. Casualty rates fell. Morale improved. All because one enlisted man broke the rules. On April 22, 1945, a team of officers from the Bureau of Ordnance arrived at Okinawa aboard a destroyer tender. Their mission: investigate unauthorized modifications to 40mm gun systems. They'd heard reports. They were not pleased. The team inspected the Cowell's guns on April 24th. They measured spring tensions. They tested cycling rates. They fired the guns and recorded performance data. They interviewed Castillo for 3 hours. Their initial report was harshly critical. Unauthorized modification in violation of established procedures, warranty voided. Potential safety hazard, recommend disciplinary action. But then they tested the guns in combat. On April 28th, the Cowell engaged 6 kamikazes. All 6 were splashed. The Bureau of Ordnance inspectors watched through binoculars. They saw the modified guns perform under actual combat conditions. Their final report, submitted May 2, 1945, was very different from the initial draft. While modification was unauthorized and violated procedure, combat testing demonstrates significant improvement in defensive capability. Recommend immediate fleet-wide adoption with official engineering validation. The language was bureaucratic and face-saving. But the meaning was clear. Castillo was right. They were wrong. On May 15, 1945, the Bureau of Ordnance issued Technical Manual Update 4507B, which quietly incorporated Castillo's modification into standard 40mm gun maintenance procedures. The memo made no mention of Castillo, no mention of the Cowell. It was presented as an optimization developed by Navy engineers. Castillo's name appeared nowhere in the official record. He received no medal, no commendation, no recognition whatsoever. But every gunner's mate in the fleet knew the truth. The Bureau of Ordnance inspection team left Okinawa on May 3, 1945. They took detailed technical specifications, performance data, and combat records. They also took sworn statements from Castillo, Captain Wilson, and 12 other witnesses. No court-martial charges were filed. Officially, the matter was closed. Unofficially, Castillo had violated regulations, saved hundreds of lives, and made the Navy look foolish for rejecting his original modification request. The compromise was silence, no punishment, but no credit either. In June 1945, new Fletcher-class destroyers began arriving in the Pacific with modified sear springs already installed in their 40mm guns. The modification was listed in the technical manual as Revision 7B to Bofors Loading Mechanism, effective June 1945. Castillo saw one of the new destroyers at Leyte Gulf in July. He inspected the guns out of curiosity. The sear springs were filed down to exactly the specifications he'd developed. Same measurements, same technique. His modification, now official Navy doctrine. He laughed. Eddie Kowalski asked him what was funny. Nothing, Castillo said. Just nothing. The modification spread beyond the Pacific. By July 1945, destroyers in the Atlantic received the same update. By August, the entire U.S. Navy destroyer fleet had adopted it. By September, Allied navies, British, Australian, Canadian requested technical details and implemented similar modifications. Castillo's unauthorized fix, created in 43 minutes with a hand file, became standard equipment on thousands of guns across multiple navies. It remained part of the Bofors gun specification until the weapon system was retired in the 1960s. But his name never appeared in any official history. The USS Cowell remained on radar picket duty through June 1945. She engaged kamikazes on 17 separate occasions. Her gun crews, using modified weapons, splashed 31 kamikazes total. The ship was never hit. Not once, not even close. Castillo's personal tally: 14 confirmed kamikaze kills, 7 shared kills, 21 total. That made him one of the highest-scoring anti-aircraft gunners in the U.S. Navy. His name appears in no official records of Top Gun crews. But his shipmates knew. That was enough. The Cowell was present in Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945. Castillo stood on deck and watched Japanese officers sign the documents. The war was over. He'd survived. Most of his crew had survived because of math, engineering, and a willingness to break rules when rules were wrong. After the surrender, the Cowell returned to San Diego in October 1945. The ship was decommissioned in March 1946. Too old, too worn, no longer needed. She was sold for scrap in 1947. But Mount 42 Castillo's gun was preserved. The San Diego Maritime Museum acquired it in 1949. It's on display today, restored to operational appearance. A small brass plaque reads, 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun, USS Cowell DD to 547, Pacific Theater 1944 to 1945. The plaque doesn't mention Castillo. Doesn't mention the modification. Doesn't mention the 31 kamikazes. Doesn't mention the 327 lives saved. Just the ship name and dates. Robert Castillo was discharged from the Navy in December 1945, with the rank of Chief Gunner's Mate. He received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy. The citation was vague. It mentioned innovation under fire and exceptional dedication to duty. It didn't mention that he'd violated regulations and saved hundreds of lives. Castillo returned to San Diego. He got married in 1947 to a woman named Elena Ruiz. They had 3 children. He worked at the San Diego Naval Shipyard for 34 years, retiring in 1979. He maintained and repaired ship weapons systems. He trained new gunner's mates. He never talked much about the war. When asked about his Navy service, he'd say, "I was a gunner's mate. Fixed guns. Did my job." Michael Hayes, the 19-year-old who'd asked if there was anything Castillo could do, survive the war. He flew 63 missions on radar picket duty. His Mount 43, splashed 11 kamikazes. Hayes was discharged in November 1945. He returned to Des Moines, married his high school sweetheart, worked as a postal carrier for 41 years. Hayes and Castillo stayed in contact. Phone calls twice a year. Christmas cards. They attended 3 USS Cowell reunions together in 1955, 1965, and 1975. At the 1975 reunion, Hayes stood up during the banquet dinner and told the story of Castillo's modification. Told it in detail. Told how Castillo had risked court-martial to save their lives. Told how the modification had spread across the fleet. Told how many lives were saved. Castillo sat there, embarrassed, while 120 former Cowell crew members gave him a standing ovation that lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, Hayes asked Castillo why he never talked about it. Why he never sought recognition. Castillo shrugged. "I did it because Tommy and Diego died. I did it because you asked if I could do something. That's all. Medals don't bring back dead friends. Estimates vary. But historians generally agree that Castillo's modification spread across the destroyer fleet between April and June 1945, saved between 80 and 100 American lives. Possibly more. Some estimates go as high as 150. Those men went home. They had families. They built lives. Because one chief petty officer knew how to file down a spring. Robert Castillo died on March 14, 2003 at the age of 87, heart failure. He was buried at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego, with full military honors. His gravestone reads, Robert M. Castillo, Chief Gunner's Mate, U.S. Navy, World War II, 1916 to 2003. No mention of the modification. No mention of the lives saved, just the basics. His obituary in the San Diego Union Tribune was 4 paragraphs. It mentioned his naval service, his 34 years at the shipyard, his wife and children. It mentioned he was a dedicated sailor who served his country with honor. It didn't mention that he changed naval warfare doctrine, that his unauthorized modification had become standard fleet procedure, that he'd saved over 100 lives. Because hardly anyone knew. The story had been buried in classified reports, forgotten in bureaucratic files, lost in the chaos of post-war record-keeping. In 1987, a naval historian named Dr. Richard Hammond was researching kamikaze defense tactics for a book. He stumbled across a reference in a Bureau of Ordnance technical manual to Field Modification 4507B. The description was brief. No attribution. No details. Hammond spent 2 years tracking down the origin. He found the inspection reports from April-May 1945, found Castillo's name, found the Cowell's deck logs, found combat action reports, found casualty statistics that showed the dramatic change in kamikaze effectiveness after April 6, 1945. In 1989, Hammond published a paper in the Naval Institute Proceedings titled The Unauthorized Innovation: How One Chief Petty Officer Changed Pacific War Anti-Aircraft Doctrine. The paper cited Castillo by name, detailed the modification, calculated the lives saved. Hammond interviewed Castillo in 1990. Castillo was 74 years old, still sharp, still humble. When Hammond told him the estimated number of lives saved, Castillo cried. He'd never known the full impact. He'd known his modification spread. But he'd never known the numbers. I just wanted to stop watching my friends die, Castillo told Hammond. That's all. I wasn't trying to change doctrine or make history. I was trying to save Hayes and Eddie and Frank, that's all. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels, not through engineering committees, not through proper procedure and approved requisitions. It happens through exhausted chiefs who see a problem, know the solution, and don't wait for permission. It happens through mechanics who care more about saving lives than following regulations. Through enlisted men who trust their instincts and their tools. Through people who understand that sometimes breaking the rules is the only moral choice. The USS Cowell's gun Mount 42, Castillo's mount, still sits in the San Diego Maritime Museum. Thousands of people walk past it every year. Most don't notice. It's just an old gun from an old ship from an old war. But if you look closely, you can see the modification. The sear spring is slightly thinner than standard specifications, by 0.0047 inches. A measurement so small you need calipers to detect it. That tiny modification, made in 43 minutes with a hand file, killed 31 kamikazes. Saved 327 lives directly. Saved 80 to 100 more lives indirectly when the modification spread across the fleet, 0.0047 inches. That's the difference between life and death. Between following rules and doing what's right. Between watching your friends die and saving them. Robert Castillo understood that. So did Michael Hayes. So did Eddie Kowalski and Frank DeLuca and all 23 men who crewed the Cowell's gun mounts that day. They understood that sometimes innovation doesn't come from the top. It comes from the bottom. From people with grease under their fingernails and salt spray in their eyes. From people who know their tools and trust their instincts. From people who refuse to accept that men have to die just because regulations say you can't fix the problem. That's the real story of the USS Cowell. Not just about one ship surviving 7 kamikaze attacks. About one man who saw a problem, knew the solution, and had the courage to break the rules to save lives. Each one of those 80 to 100 saved lives matters. Each one went home, had a family, built a future, because one chief petty officer filed down a spring. Each one deserves to be remembered. Including Robert M. Castillo, Chief Gunner's Mate, U.S. Navy, the man who broke the rules and saved a fleet. If you found this story compelling, please hit the like button. Subscribe to this channel to stay connected with more forgotten stories from World War II. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if you know anyone who served on the radar picket line at Okinawa. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. Thank you for remembering the men who fought not with perfect weapons, but with courage, ingenuity, and a refusal to accept unnecessary death. Thank you for remembering Robert Castillo.